The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Viper, where Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her oil-stained hand. The desert heat was already building, even at 0600 hours, and she knew it would be another scorching day maintaining the aircraft that kept her fellow soldiers alive in the unforgiving landscape of Afghanistan. Maria had been working on Apache helicopters for 6 years, ever since she enlisted straight out of high school in El Paso. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who lost his left leg to a landmine, had tried to talk her out of joining the military. But Maria was stubborn, just like him, and she wanted to serve her country while learning a skill that could support her family back home. Her mother worked double shifts at a factory, and her younger brother needed money for college. The Apache AH-64 sitting before her was a magnificent machine, despite its battle scars. This particular bird, tail number 07-05489, had been through hell and back. Maria knew every rivet, every wire, and every system on this aircraft better than she knew her own reflection. She had personally overseen its maintenance for the past 8 months, and it had never failed to bring its crew home safely. Today, she was working on the M230 chain gun, the 30mm cannon mounted beneath the aircraft's nose. The weapon had been jamming intermittently during the last 3 missions, and Maria was determined to find the source of the problem. She carefully removed the access panels, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the bulky work gloves she wore for protection. The other soldiers on base respected Maria, though she sometimes felt the weight of being one of only a handful of women in her unit. She had proven herself time and again, working longer hours than anyone else, volunteering for the most dangerous maintenance tasks, and never complaining about the conditions. Her supervisors trusted her completely, often assigning her the most critical aircraft when missions were pending. As she worked, Maria thought about the letter she had received from her brother the day before. David was doing well in his engineering program, but their mother was struggling with the mortgage payments. The factory where she worked had reduced hours, and money was tighter than ever. Maria had been sending most of her combat pay home, but it still wasn't enough. She had been considering extending her deployment to earn additional hazard pay, even though she was already 3 months past her original rotation date. The sound of approaching footsteps on the concrete made her look up from her work. Chief Warrant Officer Jim Baker was walking toward her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Baker was a veteran pilot with over 15 years of experience flying Apaches, and he had a reputation for being tough but fair. More importantly, he always looked out for his maintenance crew. "Morning, Santos," Baker said, offering her one of the cups. "How's our bird looking today?" "Good morning, Chief," Maria replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The gun's been acting up, but I think I found the problem. There's a loose connection in the firing mechanism. Should have it fixed within the hour." Baker nodded, sipping his coffee as he examined the aircraft. "You've been putting in a lot of hours lately. When's the last time you took some leave?" Maria shrugged. "Leave's for people who have somewhere to go, Chief. Besides, someone needs to keep these birds flying." It was true. Maria rarely took time off, partly because she needed the money, but also because she genuinely loved her work. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a complex machine that others had given up on and nursing it back to perfect working condition. Each successful repair meant that pilots and crew members would come home safely to their families. The base was beginning to come alive around them. Other maintenance personnel were arriving for their shifts, and she could hear the distant sound of PT formations running along the perimeter road. The smell of breakfast drifted from the mess hall, mixing with the familiar sense of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and desert dust that seemed to permeate everything on the base. Maria's uniform was already stained with grease and hydraulic fluid, despite the early hour. She wore the standard Army combat uniform in the digital camouflage pattern, with her sleeves rolled up to stay cool in the desert heat. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and safety glasses hung around her neck. On her left shoulder, she wore the patch of the 1st Cavalry Division, and, below that, the subdued American flag that all soldiers wore into combat. But it was the small patch on her right shoulder that held special meaning for her. It was a simple black and yellow design with a lightning bolt and the words "Thunder from Above," the unofficial motto of her maintenance unit. What made it special was that it had belonged to her father during his service in Vietnam. He had given it to her before she deployed, telling her it had brought him luck and hoping it would do the same for her. "Santos," Baker said, interrupting her thoughts. "I need to talk to you about something. Walk with me." Maria set down her tools and followed the chief warrant officer away from the aircraft. They walked toward the edge of the flight line, where they could talk without being overheard by the other soldiers. "I've been watching your work for months now," Baker began. "You're one of the best mechanics I've ever worked with. Your attention to detail is outstanding, and you have an instinct for troubleshooting that can't be taught." Maria felt a warm sense of pride at the compliment, but she sensed there was more coming. "That's why I want to recommend you for the warrant officer program," Baker continued. "You could be flying these birds instead of just fixing them. The Army needs pilots with your technical background and dedication." The offer caught Maria completely off guard. She had never seriously considered becoming a pilot, mainly because she assumed it was beyond her reach. Warrant officer training was highly competitive, and flight school was even more demanding. "I appreciate the recommendation, Chief, but I'm not sure I'm pilot material," Maria said honestly. "Besides, my family needs the money I'm making now. I can't afford to take time off for training." Baker smiled. "Flight school pays well, Santos. Better than what you're making now, and the career prospects are much better long-term. Think about it. You don't have to decide today, but don't sell yourself short." As they walked back toward the aircraft, Maria's mind was spinning with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. Flying had always seemed like something other people did, people with more education or better connections. She was just a girl from El Paso who was good with her hands and didn't mind getting dirty. The rest of the morning passed quickly as Maria finished repairing the chain gun and conducted her routine pre-flight inspections. The Apache was scheduled to fly a reconnaissance mission that afternoon, and she wanted everything to be perfect. She checked fluid levels, examined control surfaces, and tested all the electronic systems. At lunchtime, Maria made her way to the mess hall, where she usually ate alone while reading technical manuals or writing letters home. The mess hall was crowded with soldiers from various units, their conversations creating a constant buzz of activity. Maria found an empty table in the corner and opened a dog-eared copy of the Apache maintenance manual. She was absorbed in reading about hydraulic system troubleshooting when someone sat down across from her. Looking up, she saw it was Specialist Rodriguez from the supply section, a young man from California who had been trying to ask her out for weeks. "Hey, Santos," Rodriguez said with his characteristic grin. "Mind if I join you?" Maria gestured to the empty seats around the table. "It's a free country, Rodriguez." "Well, sort of." Rodriguez laughed at her joke and began eating his lunch. "So what are you reading? More aircraft stuff?" "Always," Maria replied. "These birds are complex machines. There's always something new to learn. Don't you ever think about anything else? Like maybe going to the movies when we get back to the States? Or dinner somewhere that doesn't serve everything out of a can?" Maria looked at Rodriguez thoughtfully. He was a nice enough guy, and, under different circumstances, she might have been interested. But her life was complicated enough without adding romance to the mix. Her family needed her focus, and her work demanded her complete attention. "Maybe when this deployment is over," she said diplomatically. "Right now, I need to stay focused on the mission." Rodriguez nodded, though she could see disappointment in his eyes. "I get it. Rain check then?" "Rain check," Maria agreed, returning to her manual. After lunch, Maria returned to the flight line to conduct the final pre-flight inspection of the Apache. The afternoon mission briefing had been moved up, and the pilots would be arriving soon to prepare for takeoff. She wanted to personally hand over the aircraft to ensure there were no surprises. As she completed her inspection, Maria noticed a small hydraulic leak that hadn't been there earlier. It was minor, probably not enough to abort the mission, but it needed to be addressed. She quickly gathered her tools and began tracing the source of the leak. The hydraulic system on an Apache helicopter is incredibly complex, with multiple redundant circuits that control everything from flight controls to weapon systems. A leak in the wrong place could be catastrophic, and Maria had seen what happened when hydraulic systems failed. She had been working on aircraft maintenance when a Blackhawk had made an emergency landing due to hydraulic failure, and she had watched the pilots struggle to maintain control during the approach. As she worked to tighten the fitting that was causing the leak, Maria heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Looking up, she saw two pilots walking toward the aircraft, dressed in their flight gear and carrying their helmets. She recognized one of them as Captain Williams, a pilot she had worked with several times before. The other pilot was new, someone she hadn't seen before. "How's she looking, Santos?" Captain Williams called out as they approached. "Almost ready, sir," Maria replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "Just fixing a small hydraulic leak. Give me 2 minutes." As she worked to complete the repair, Maria was aware that the new pilot was watching her closely. She could feel his eyes on her as she methodically checked her work and cleaned up her tools. When she finally stood up and turned to face the pilots, she was surprised to see that the new pilot was staring intently at the patch on her right shoulder. The pilot was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years in the desert sun. His name tape read Mitchell, and she could see captain's bars on his collar. But what struck her most was the expression on his face as he stared at her father's patch. His face had gone completely pale, and his hands were trembling slightly. "Sir? Are you all right?" Maria asked, concerned that the pilot might be having some kind of medical emergency. Captain Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He continued to stare at the patch, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Captain Williams noticed his colleague's distress and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mitchell? What's wrong?" Williams asked. Slowly, Captain Mitchell raised his eyes from the patch to meet Maria's gaze. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that patch?" Maria looked down at her shoulder, confused by the intensity of his reaction. "It was my father's, sir. He served in Vietnam." "Your father," Mitchell repeated, his voice growing stronger but still shaky. "What was his name? What unit was he with?" "Staff Sergeant Carlos Santos, sir. 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Squadron, 9th Cavalry Regiment. He was a door gunner on Huey's." The color drained completely from Mitchell's face, and, for a moment, Maria thought he might collapse. Captain Williams moved closer to his fellow pilot, clearly alarmed by his reaction. "Santos," Mitchell said, reaching out to steady himself against the aircraft. "Carlos Santos from El Paso?" "Yes, sir," Maria replied, now completely confused. "Did you know my father?" Mitchell closed his eyes tightly, as if he were in physical pain. When he opened them again, there were tears beginning to form. "I need to sit down," he said quietly. Captain Williams helped guide Mitchell to a nearby maintenance stand, where he sat heavily and put his head in his hands. Maria stood frozen, unsure of what was happening or what she should do. "Mitchell, what the hell is going on?" Williams demanded. "Do you know Santos?" Mitchell looked up at Maria with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was a mixture of pain, guilt, and something else she couldn't identify. "I knew your father," Mitchell said finally. "We served together in Vietnam. He saved my life." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Her father had rarely talked about his time in Vietnam, and, when he did, it was usually just general stories about the weather or the food. He had never mentioned specific people or events, and Maria had always assumed it was because the memories were too painful. "You knew my dad?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of aircraft engines in the distance. Mitchell nodded slowly. "Carlos Santos was the bravest man I ever knew. And I owe him everything." The afternoon heat seemed to intensify around them as the three soldiers stood in the shadow of the Apache helicopter. Maria felt as if the world had suddenly shifted on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. "Sir, I think maybe we should postpone this mission," Captain Williams said, clearly concerned about his fellow pilot's emotional state. But Mitchell was already standing up, wiping his eyes and straightening his flight gear. "No," he said firmly. "We have a job to do. But, Santos, after we land, I need to talk to you. There are things about your father that you need to know." Maria nodded, though her mind was reeling with questions. As she watched the two pilots begin their pre-flight procedures, she couldn't help but wonder what secrets her father had kept hidden all these years. And why had seeing his old patch affected Captain Mitchell so profoundly? The Apache's engines began to spool up, and Maria stepped back to a safe distance as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the desert sky, she found herself staring at the patch on her shoulder with new eyes. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, Maria felt truly alone. The patch that had always been a source of comfort and connection to her father now seemed like a mystery waiting to be solved. And, somewhere in the back of her mind, she had the unsettling feeling that whatever Captain Mitchell had to tell her would change everything she thought she knew about her family and her father's service. The rest of the afternoon dragged by slowly as Maria tried to focus on her work while her mind raced with questions and possibilities. What had happened in Vietnam between her father and Captain Mitchell? Why had her father never mentioned this man who claimed to owe him everything? And why did Mitchell look so haunted when he saw the patch? As the sun began to set over the Afghan desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Maria found herself counting the minutes until the Apache returned. She had always been patient, methodical, and focused on the task at hand. But now, for the first time in her military career, she was desperate for answers that had nothing to do with aircraft maintenance or military procedures. The sound of approaching rotors eventually broke through her anxious thoughts, and Maria looked up to see the familiar silhouette of the Apache returning from its mission. As the aircraft settled onto the landing pad and the engines wound down, she felt her heart racing with anticipation and nervousness. Captain Mitchell climbed out of the cockpit and removed his helmet, his movements deliberate and measured. When his eyes met Maria's across the tarmac, she could see that he had made a decision about something. Whatever he was going to tell her, she knew that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Captain Mitchell approached Maria slowly after completing his post-flight procedures, his movements deliberate and careful, like a man walking through a minefield. The desert evening air was cooler now, but Maria could see perspiration beading on his forehead despite the temperature drop. Captain Williams had already headed to the operations center for mission debrief, leaving them alone on the darkening tarmac. "Sergeant Santos," Mitchell began, then stopped and shook his head. "I'm sorry, I keep thinking of him when I look at you. You have his eyes, you know. Same determination, same fire." Maria stood perfectly still, wrench still in her hand from the post-flight inspection she had been conducting. "Sir, you're starting to scare me. What happened over there? What happened with my father?" Mitchell gestured toward a small maintenance building nearby. "Can we talk somewhere private? This isn't a conversation for the flight line." They walked to the building in silence, their boots echoing against the concrete. Inside, Mitchell pulled up two folding chairs and positioned them facing each other under a harsh fluorescent light. The space smelled of motor oil and metal polish, familiar scents that usually comforted Maria but now seemed to amplify her anxiety. "Before I tell you anything," Mitchell said, settling into his chair, "I need you to know that your father was a hero. Not just to the army, not just to his country, but to me personally. What I'm about to share with you, he never wanted anyone to know. He made me promise." Maria's throat felt dry. "What kind of promise?" Mitchell stared at his hands for a long moment before beginning. "It was 1969. I was 22 years old, fresh out of flight school, cocky as hell and convinced I was invincible. Your father was already a veteran door gunner, been in country for 8 months. I was assigned to his bird, a UH-1D Huey, for my first combat mission." The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across Mitchell's weathered face. Maria found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell and prevent him from continuing. "The mission was supposed to be routine," Mitchell continued. "Extract a long-range reconnaissance patrol that had been operating in the Ashau Valley for a week. Intelligence said the area was clear, no enemy activity reported. But intelligence was wrong. They were very wrong." Mitchell paused and rubbed his temples, as if the memory was causing him physical pain. "We flew in low and fast, just like we'd trained. The LRP team was waiting for us in a small clearing, 6 guys who looked like they'd been through hell. They were supposed to be extracted 2 days earlier, but weather had kept us grounded." "What happened?" Maria asked quietly. "We were loading the patrol team when the world exploded around us. The NVA had been waiting, probably for days. They hit us with everything they had: AK-47s, RPGs, mortars. Our pilot, a guy named Thompson, took a round through the chest in the first 10 seconds. The co-pilot was trying to maintain control, but we were taking heavy fire from 3 sides." Mitchell stood up and began pacing the small room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I was the crew chief on that bird, responsible for getting everyone out alive. But I was just a kid, scared out of my mind, and I froze. Completely froze. While bullets were coming through the cabin and men were screaming, I just sat there like a statue." Maria could see the shame in his eyes, even after all these years. "That's when your father took over. He grabbed me by my flak jacket, looked me right in the eyes, and said, "Boy, you can be scared later. Right now, these men need you." Then, he positioned me at the left door gun and took the right side himself. The building seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very walls were listening to the story. Maria could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. For the next 20 minutes, your father kept us alive through sheer will and incredible marksmanship. He called out targets, directed our defensive fire, and somehow managed to keep the enemy from overrunning our position. The co-pilot was trying to get us airborne, but we had hydraulic damage and the engine was running rough. Mitchell sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Then, the worst happened. An RPG hit our tail boom, and we started spinning out of control. The co-pilot fought it all the way down, but we hit hard in a rice paddy about 200 meters from the LZ. "Was anyone hurt in the crash?" Maria asked. 3 of the LRP team members were injured, one pretty severely. Our co-pilot had a concussion, and I had a broken wrist. But we were all alive, and that was more than we had any right to expect. The problem was, we were still in enemy territory, and they knew exactly where we were. Mitchell stood again and walked to the small window that looked out over the flight line. In the distance, they could see the lights of other aircraft being prepared for night missions. The radio was damaged in the crash, so we couldn't call for immediate extraction. Your father organized our defensive perimeter while I tried to fix the radio. The NVA were regrouping for another attack, and we all knew it was just a matter of time. "How long were you on the ground?" Maria asked. 6 hours, Mitchell replied. 6 hours that felt like 6 years. Your father kept us organized, kept us fighting, kept us believing we were going to make it home. He redistributed ammunition, treated the wounded, and maintained radio discipline when we finally got the emergency frequency working. Maria tried to imagine her father, just a few years older than she was now, taking charge in such a desperate situation. The man she knew was quiet and thoughtful, more comfortable fixing things than leading people. When the extraction birds finally arrived, we were down to our last magazines of ammunition. The NVA had been probing our perimeter for hours, and we knew they were preparing for a final assault. Your father volunteered to stay behind and provide covering fire while the wounded were loaded onto the rescue helicopter. Mitchell turned away from the window to face Maria directly. "I should have been the one to stay. I was the crew chief, it was my responsibility." But I was still shaking from fear, still not thinking clearly. Carlos saw that I wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, so he made the decision for both of us. "He stayed behind," Maria said, not really asking a question. "He stayed behind with 2 of the LRP team members who were still combat effective. Told me to get on that helicopter and make sure the wounded made it to medical care. The last thing he said to me was, 'Take care of them, Mitchell.' That's what we do." Maria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This story was so different from anything her father had ever told her about Vietnam. He had always made it sound routine, boring even. "The extraction bird was taking fire as we lifted off," Mitchell continued. "I watched from the door gunner position as your father and those 2 Rangers held off what looked like an entire company of NVA regulars. They were completely surrounded, but they kept firing, kept the enemy from advancing on the landing zone." "How did he get out?" Maria asked, though she already suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. Mitchell was quiet for a long time before responding. "He didn't. Not right away. We had to leave him and the 2 Rangers behind because the helicopter was too damaged to stay on the ground any longer. It took another 4 hours to organize a proper rescue mission. The fluorescent light continued its intermittent flickering, and Maria could hear the distant sound of generators humming outside the building. She felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for the rest of the story. When we finally got back with a full assault force, we found your father and one of the Rangers still alive, still holding their position. The other Ranger had been killed, but Carlos had managed to keep them from being overrun. He was wounded in 3 places, but he was still conscious, still fighting." Mitchell sat back down and looked directly at Maria. "The doctors at the field hospital said he should have died twice over from blood loss. But Carlos Santos was the toughest man any of us had ever seen. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital, then went right back to flight duty." "The landmine," Maria said suddenly. "That's not how he lost his leg." Mitchell shook his head. "No. That happened 3 months later, on what was supposed to be his last mission before rotating home. Another extraction, another helicopter going down in enemy territory. But, by then, Carlos was a legend. Other crews would request him specifically because they knew he'd bring them home. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process everything she was hearing. Why didn't he ever tell me any of this? Why did he lie about the landmine? Because he didn't want to be seen as a hero, Mitchell replied. Carlos always said he was just doing his job, just taking care of his people. He didn't want the attention, didn't want the medals and ceremonies. He just wanted to come home to his family and live a quiet life. What happened to you after Vietnam? Maria asked. Mitchell smiled slightly, the first time his expression had lightened during the entire conversation. Your father saved me in more ways than one. After that mission, I was a different pilot, a different man. I learned what real leadership looked like, what it meant to put others before yourself. I stayed in the army, made it my career, and tried every day to live up to the standard Carlos set that day in the rice paddy. Maria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the aircraft scattered across the tarmac. The Apache she had been working on earlier was already being prepared for another mission, its weapons systems gleaming under the floodlights. There's something else, Mitchell said quietly. Something your father made me promise to do if I ever met any of his family. Maria turned back to face him. What kind of promise? Mitchell reached into his flight suit pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He gave this to me in the hospital, right before he was medevaced to Japan for surgery on his leg. He said if anything ever happened to him, or if I ever met his children, I should give it to them. With trembling hands, Maria took the envelope. Her name was written on the front in her father's careful handwriting, though the ink had faded over the years. He knew you would join the military someday, Mitchell said. Said you had the same spirit he did, the same need to serve something bigger than yourself. He was proud of that, but he was also worried about you. Maria stared at the envelope, afraid to open it. Worried about what? Read the letter, Mitchell said gently. It explains everything better than I can. With shaking fingers, Maria opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Her father's handwriting was clear and precise, each word carefully chosen. My dear Maria, the letter began. If you are reading this, then fate has brought you and Lieutenant Mitchell together, just as I always hoped it would. I know you must be confused and probably angry that I never told you these stories myself. Please understand that I kept these memories buried not because I was ashamed of them, but because I wanted to protect you from the weight of them. Maria's vision blurred as she continued reading. You have always been my greatest pride and my biggest worry. You have the same fire that drove me to volunteer for combat duty, the same need to prove yourself in dangerous places. I see it in the way you take apart every machine you encounter, the way you push yourself harder than anyone expects. This is both your greatest strength and your greatest danger. The letter continued for 2 more paragraphs, but Maria had to stop reading as tears made it impossible to see the words clearly. Mitchell waited patiently, understanding the emotional weight of what she was experiencing. He knew, Maria said finally. Somehow he knew I would end up here, doing this job. Your father was a very wise man, Mitchell replied. And he was right about you. Watching you work on that aircraft today, seeing the care and precision you put into everything you do, it's like seeing Carlos all over again. Maria folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Sir, can I ask you something? Anything. The patch, Maria said, touching the unit insignia on her shoulder. This was really his? Mitchell nodded. He gave it to me that day in the hospital, along with the letter. Said he wanted me to hold on to it until I could give it to you personally. I've been carrying it in my personal gear for over 40 years. Maria stared at him in shock. You mean this isn't the patch from his uniform? No, Mitchell said with a slight smile. That patch belonged to me. I traded it to your father after our first mission together, as a way of saying thank you. When he gave it back to me in the hospital, he said it should find its way to you someday. He was always thinking ahead, always planning for contingencies. The implications of what Mitchell was telling her slowly sank in. This patch, which she had worn with such pride, thinking it connected her to her father's service, was actually a gift from this man who owed her father his life. I don't understand, Maria said. Why would he give you his patch? Because that's the kind of man Carlos Santos was, Mitchell replied. He saw a scared young pilot who needed confidence, and he gave him something tangible to hold on to. Your father understood that sometimes people need physical reminders of their own courage. Maria looked down at the patch again, seeing it with completely new eyes. And, you've been carrying this around for 40 years, waiting to meet me? I've been carrying it around hoping to meet you, Mitchell corrected. Your father told me about his little girl who loved to take apart radios and fix bicycles. He said someday you were going to surprise everyone by being better at everything than they expected. The weight of this revelation was almost overwhelming. Maria had built her identity around being Carlos Santos's daughter, the girl who inherited his mechanical aptitude and his stubborn determination. Now she was learning that her father's legacy was far more complex and heroic than she had ever imagined. What am I supposed to do with all this? Maria asked, feeling suddenly lost and confused. The same thing your father would do, Mitchell replied. Take care of your people. Keep learning, keep growing, keep pushing yourself to be better. And, maybe, someday, consider that warrant officer program I mentioned earlier. Maria looked at him sharply. You knew about that recommendation before today? Mitchell smiled. I've been watching your work for weeks, Maria. When I heard there was a Santos working on aircraft maintenance, I had to know if you were Carlos's daughter. Your supervisor speaks very highly of you. Says you have an instinct for troubleshooting that can't be taught. Chief Baker told you to recommend me for flight school, Maria said, suddenly understanding. No, Mitchell shook his head. Baker mentioned the possibility, but the recommendation is entirely mine. You have the skills, the dedication, and the leadership potential to be an outstanding pilot. More importantly, you have your father's courage and his sense of responsibility to others. Maria sat back down, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely energized. The conversation had turned her world upside down, but it had also given her a new understanding of herself and her place in the military. Sir, can I ask one more question? Of course. If my father was such a hero, why didn't he ever get any medals? Why didn't anyone ever tell these stories? Mitchell was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He did get medals, Maria. Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters. But Carlos didn't want any of that recognition. He said the only reward he needed was bringing his people home safely. Where are the medals now? I honestly don't know. Your father might have them stored away somewhere, or he might have returned them to the army. He was very serious about not wanting to be treated as a hero. As they sat in the small maintenance building, Maria began to understand why her father had been so supportive of her decision to join the military, despite his initial protests. He knew that she had inherited not just his mechanical skills, but his need to serve others and protect the people around her. The sound of aircraft engines starting up outside broke the spell of their conversation. Both Maria and Mitchell looked toward the window, where they could see crews preparing for night missions. I should let you get back to your duties, Mitchell said, standing up from his chair. Sir, Maria said, also standing. Thank you for telling me all this. I know it wasn't easy. It was an honor, Mitchell replied. Your father asked me to watch out for you if our paths ever crossed. I intend to keep that promise. As they prepared to leave the maintenance building, Maria felt as though she was stepping into a completely new life. The patch on her shoulder felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of its true history. But it also felt more meaningful, connecting her not just to her father's service, but to a legacy of courage and sacrifice that she was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks after her life-changing conversation with Captain Mitchell, Maria found herself staring at a stack of paperwork on her bunk that could reshape her entire future. The warrant officer application form seemed to mock her every time she walked into her small living quarters, filled out halfway and, then, abandoned whenever doubt crept in. The desert nights in Afghanistan were surprisingly cold, and Maria pulled her poncho liner around her shoulders as she sat on the edge of her cot, holding her father's letter under the dim light of her reading lamp. She had read it dozens of times since Mitchell gave it to her, but tonight she was focusing on one particular paragraph that had been haunting her thoughts. You will face moments when you must choose between safety and service, between the easy path and the right one. When those moments come, remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and never forget that the people counting on you deserve your very best. Those words seemed prophetic now, as Maria wrestled with the biggest decision of her military career. The warrant officer program represented everything she thought she wanted: the chance to fly, better pay, and the opportunity to follow in her father's footsteps in a way she had never imagined possible. But it also meant leaving behind the work she loved and the certainty of her current role. The sound of boots on the wooden walkway outside her quarters interrupted her thoughts. A sharp knock on her door was followed by the voice of Sergeant First Class Davis, her squad leader.
Santos. You in there? Need you in the maintenance bay ASAP. We've got a situation.
Maria quickly folded her father's letter and stuffed it into her cargo pocket along with the warrant officer paperwork.
Whatever was happening in the maintenance bay at 2100 hours couldn't be good news.
The flight line was bustling with activity despite the late hour. Floodlights illuminated 3 Apache helicopters in various states of repair, while maintenance crews worked with the focused urgency that usually meant an emergency mission was being planned. Maria found Sergeant Davis standing next to the Apache she had been working on earlier that week. The aircraft looked different somehow, and it took her a moment to realize that someone had removed several access panels from the engine compartment.
What's the situation, Sergeant? Maria asked, pulling on her work gloves.
We've got a search and rescue mission launching in 6 hours, Davis replied, his voice tight with stress. Special operations team went missing during a reconnaissance patrol, last known position about 40 clicks north of here. This bird is supposed to provide close air support for the rescue effort. Maria looked at the exposed engine components and immediately understood the problem.
The turbine housing is cracked. How bad is it? Bad enough that nobody else wants to sign off on the aircraft for flight status, Davis replied. Chief Baker specifically requested you take a look at it. Says if anyone can get this bird flying safely, it's you.
Maria felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders.
Other soldiers' lives depended on her technical expertise and attention to detail. This was exactly the kind of situation her father had described in his letter, a moment when she had to choose between the easy path and the right one. She grabbed a flashlight and began her examination of the turbine housing. The crack was located in a critical stress point, the kind of damage that could lead to catastrophic engine failure if not properly addressed. But the crack was also in a location that might be reparable with the right technique and materials. How long do I have?
Maria asked, already mentally cataloging the tools and parts she would need.
Sunrise, Davis replied.
Mission briefing is at 0530, wheels up at 0600.
Maria checked her watch.
That gave her less than 8 hours to complete what normally would be a 12-hour repair job. But she had worked miracles before, and the knowledge that fellow soldiers were depending on her success pushed aside any thoughts of impossibility. I'll need Specialist Rodriguez from Supply to pull some parts for me, Maria said. And see if you can get Martinez from second shift to help with the reassembly. As Davis walked away to gather the requested assistance, Maria began the methodical process of removing the damaged components. Each bolt had to be carefully cataloged, each wire bundle properly secured, and each system properly isolated before the real work could begin. Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes later with a box of parts and his characteristic grin, despite the late hour and serious nature of the situation. Heard you're trying to work another miracle, Santos, he said, setting down the parts box.
What can I do to help?
Hand me that torque wrench and try to stay out of my way, Maria replied, though she was grateful for his presence. Working alone on a complex repair like this would have been nearly impossible within the time constraints. As the night wore on, Maria fell into the focused rhythm that always accompanied her most challenging work. Her hands moved with practiced precision, while her mind calculated stress loads, mental fatigue factors, and safety margins. This was more than just mechanical repair, it was engineering problem solving at its most demanding level. Around midnight, Captain Mitchell appeared at her workstation carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing his flight gear.
Thought you might need some caffeine, he said, offering her one of the cups.
Maria paused in her work and accepted the coffee gratefully.
Thanks, sir. Are you flying this mission? Mitchell nodded. Lead pilot for the rescue operation. That's my bird you're working on.
The knowledge that Mitchell would be trusting his life to her repair work added another layer of pressure to the situation. But it also provided motivation. This man had served with her father, had seen firsthand what Carlos Santos was capable of under extreme pressure.
How confident are you that this repair will hold?
Mitchell asked, examining her work with the trained eye of an experienced pilot. Confident enough that I'd fly in this aircraft myself, Maria replied honestly. The repair technique I'm using is actually stronger than the original component in some ways. But, it's also more complex, which means more potential failure points. Mitchell knelt down next to her workstation, studying the intricate metalwork she had been performing. Your father would be proud of what you're doing here. This is exactly the kind of dedication and skill that made him special. Sir, can I ask you something? Maria said, pausing in her work. In Vietnam, when things got really bad, how did my father stay focused? How did he keep doing his job when lives were on the line? Mitchell considered the question carefully. Carlos used to say that focusing on the mission was the only way to survive the pressure. He said if you started thinking too much about the consequences of failure, you'd paralyze yourself with fear. So he broke everything down into simple steps: fix this, check that, move on to the next task. That's exactly what I'm doing right now, Maria realized. I know, Mitchell smiled. It's like watching Carlos work, except he usually had grease under his fingernails and you somehow managed to stay cleaner. As the night progressed, more personnel gathered around Maria's workstation. Word had spread through the base that Santos was attempting an extraordinarily complex repair under impossible time constraints. Other maintenance personnel offered assistance or advice, but mostly they just watched in fascination as Maria methodically solved each problem as it arose. Chief Warrant Officer Baker arrived around 0300 hours, just as Maria was beginning the final reassembly process. He examined her work with the critical eye of someone who had been maintaining aircraft for over 20 years. Outstanding work, Santos, Baker said finally. This repair technique isn't even in the technical manuals. Where did you learn it? Improvisation, Chief, Maria replied, carefully torquing the final bolts to specification. Sometimes you have to modify standard procedures when standard procedures aren't enough. That's advanced thinking, the kind of problem solving we need in our warrant officers, Baker said meaningfully. Speaking of which, have you made any decisions about that application? Maria glanced around at the group of soldiers who had gathered to watch her work. These were her people, the men and women she had served with and learned from over the past year. Leaving them to attend flight school felt like abandoning her family. Still considering it, Chief, she replied diplomatically. The final hour before sunrise was spent conducting comprehensive system checks and documentation. Every repair had to be properly logged, every test result recorded, and every safety protocol verified. Maria was acutely aware that any mistake in her paperwork could ground the aircraft even if the repair itself was perfect. As the sun began to rise over the Afghan desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Maria completed her final inspection of the Apache helicopter. The aircraft looked ready for combat, its weapons systems gleaming under the morning light and its engines purring smoothly during the engine run-up test. The rescue mission briefing was conducted in the operations center, with Maria attending as the responsible maintenance technician for the lead aircraft. The missing special operations team had been located by satellite imagery, but their condition was unknown and their position was in hostile territory. Captain Mitchell would be flying lead, with Captain Williams as his wingman in his second Apache. 2 Blackhawk helicopters would carry the actual rescue team, while the Apaches provided close air support and reconnaissance. Santos, Mitchell said as the briefing concluded, I want you on the flight line during launch, in case we have any technical issues with your repairs. Maria nodded, though she was feeling the exhaustion of having worked all night. Her hands were steady and her mind was clear, but she could feel the physical fatigue building in her muscles. As the air crews conducted their pre-flight inspections, Maria performed one final check of her repair work. Every bolt was properly torqued, every wire properly routed, and every system properly tested. But she also knew that the real test would come when the aircraft was pushed to its limits in combat conditions. The Apache engines spun up with their characteristic whine, building to the thunderous roar that always made Maria's heart race with excitement. She watched from the flight line as Mitchell lifted off, followed closely by Williams in the second aircraft. The 2 Apaches quickly disappeared into the morning haze, heading north toward the location of the missing soldiers. For the next 6 hours, Maria waited in the maintenance bay with a radio tuned to the rescue frequency. Periodic updates came through about the mission progress, but the technical language and radio protocols made it difficult to understand exactly what was happening. Around noon, the radio crackled with Mitchell's voice requesting immediate medical support for multiple casualties. The rescue had been successful, but apparently not without cost. Maria felt her stomach tighten with worry about the condition of the missing soldiers and the possibility that her aircraft might have developed problems during the mission. When the Apaches finally appeared on the horizon, Maria could see immediately that something was different about Mitchell's aircraft. The helicopter was flying lower than normal and seemed to be struggling to maintain altitude. As the aircraft approached the landing pad, Maria could see hydraulic fluid streaming from the engine compartment exactly where she had made her repairs 12 hours earlier. Her heart sank as she realized that her work might have failed, potentially putting the rescue mission and the aircrews at risk. The Apache touched down heavily, and Mitchell shut down the engines immediately rather than following standard procedures. As the rotors spun down, Maria ran toward the aircraft with her toolkit, prepared for the worst. "How bad is it?" she called out as Mitchell climbed from the cockpit. "Your repair held perfectly," Mitchell replied with a tired smile. "We took some small arms fire that damaged a hydraulic line, but your turbine housing never gave us a single problem." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. "The fluid leak isn't from my repair?" "Completely unrelated," Mitchell confirmed. "Battle damage from the rescue operation. Your work probably saved the mission and, possibly our lives." As the rescue helicopters landed with the recovered special operations team, Maria found herself thinking about her father's words in his letter. She had faced a moment when she had to choose between the easy path and the right one, and she had chosen to trust her training and instincts despite the enormous pressure. But, more importantly, she had successfully contributed to saving the lives of fellow soldiers. The missing special operations team was alive and would be going home to their families because she had been willing to work all night to ensure their rescue aircraft was mission-ready. "Santos," Chief Baker said, approaching her as she began her post-flight inspection of Mitchell's aircraft. "I think it's time you seriously considered that warrant officer application. What you did last night, that wasn't just mechanical skill. That was leadership under pressure." Maria looked at the damaged Apache, then at the rescued soldiers being loaded onto medical transport helicopters, and, finally, at the patch on her shoulder that connected her to her father's legacy of service and sacrifice. "Chief," she said finally, "I think I'm ready to fill out those forms." As the sun reached its peak in the Afghan sky, Maria realized that her life was about to change in ways she was only beginning to understand. The scared girl from El Paso who had enlisted to help her family was evolving into a confident soldier who could handle the most demanding challenges the military could present. The path ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but, for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, Maria felt truly ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. 2 months later, Maria stood in front of the mirror in her quarters, adjusting her dress uniform for what she knew would be the last time at Forward Operating Base Viper. Her warrant officer application had been approved with unprecedented speed, and she was scheduled to depart for flight school at Fort Rucker, Alabama, in 3 days. The small room that had been her home for over a year looked strange with her personal belongings packed into 2 duffel bags and a footlocker. The technical manuals she had studied every night were boxed up and ready for shipment, along with the tools she had accumulated during her deployment. Everything except her father's letter and the patch on her uniform, which would travel with her to her new assignment. A knock on her door interrupted her final preparations. "Come in," she called, expecting to see one of her fellow mechanics stopping by to say goodbye. Instead, Captain Mitchell stepped into the room, carrying a small wooden box and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sir," Maria said, surprised by the visit. "I thought you were flying a mission this morning." "Mission was scrubbed due to weather," Mitchell replied. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you before you leave." "Mind if I sit down?" Maria gestured to her desk chair while she remained standing, unsure of the protocol for such an informal visit from an officer. "Maria," Mitchell began, using her first name for the first time since they had met. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation in that maintenance building, and I realize there are some things I never told you about your father." "More stories from Vietnam?" Maria asked, settling onto the edge of her cot. "Not exactly," Mitchell said, setting the wooden box on her desk. "After Vietnam, after your father recovered from his injuries and came home, we stayed in touch. Not regularly, but we exchanged letters a few times a year. Christmas cards, updates on our families, that sort of thing." Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Every new revelation about her father's life seemed to reshape her understanding of the man she thought she knew so well. "He wrote to me when you graduated from high school," Mitchell continued. "Sent me a picture of you in your cap and gown, told me you had been accepted to 3 different colleges but were thinking about joining the army instead. He never told me he was writing to anyone about my plans, Maria said quietly. Carlos was worried about you, but he was also incredibly proud. He said you reminded him of himself at that age, determined to serve others, but maybe not fully understanding the cost of that service. Mitchell opened the wooden box and carefully removed what appeared to be a small medal wrapped in tissue paper. He asked me to give you this if you ever made it through your first deployment successfully. Maria unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal a silver star medal, its distinctive blue ribbon and silver star gleaming under the fluorescent lights of her quarters. She had seen these medals in museums and ceremonies, but never held one in her hands. This was his, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Awarded for his actions during the mission I told you about, and several others. Your father tried to refuse it, said he was just doing his job. The army gave it to him anyway. Maria turned the medal over in her hands, feeling the weight of the history it represented. Why didn't he keep it himself? Because he wanted you to understand that heroism isn't about medals or recognition, Mitchell explained. It's about making the right choices when everything is chaos around you. He said if you made it through your first deployment with the same courage and dedication he saw in you as a child, then you had earned the right to carry his legacy forward. The room seemed to grow very quiet around them. Maria could hear the distant sounds of aircraft engines and conversations from other soldiers, but those noises felt far away and unimportant compared to the weight of what Mitchell was sharing with her. There's something else, Mitchell said, reaching back into the box. Your father wrote you another letter, to be given to you only if you decided to become a pilot. Maria accepted the second letter with trembling hands. This envelope was newer than the first one, and her name was written in the same careful handwriting she remembered from birthday cards and school permission slips. He knew, Maria said in amazement. Somehow he knew this would happen. Your father was very good at reading people, Mitchell replied. He could see potential in others long before they could see it in themselves. It's one of the qualities that made him such an effective leader. Maria opened the envelope and unfolded the letter, immediately recognizing the stationery her father had always used for important correspondence. My dearest Maria, the letter began. If you are reading this, then you have chosen a path that both thrills and terrifies me. Flying is the most dangerous job in the military, but it is also the most rewarding for those who are called to do it. Maria paused in her reading and looked up at Mitchell. When did he write this? About 5 years ago, shortly after his first heart attack. He said he wanted to make sure all his important thoughts were written down, just in case. Maria returned to the letter, feeling her father's presence in every word. You have always been stronger and more capable than you realize. I see in you the same qualities that allowed me to survive Vietnam and build a good life afterward: courage, determination, and, most importantly, the ability to stay focused on what matters when everything else falls apart. The letter continued for 2 more pages, filled with advice about flying, leadership, and the responsibilities that came with being an Army aviator. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to Maria's eyes. I know that my silence about my own service has sometimes frustrated you, and I hope you can forgive an old soldier for wanting to protect his daughter from the weight of his memories. But now that you have chosen this path, I want you to know that I could not be more proud of the woman you have become. Fly safe, serve well, and never forget that you carry the hopes and dreams of everyone who loves you. Maria folded the letter carefully and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I wish I could have talked to him about all of this before he died. In a way, you are talking to him, Mitchell said gently. These letters, the stories I've shared with you, they're his way of continuing to guide and support you even though he's not here physically. A comfortable silence settled between them as Maria processed everything she had learned about her father over the past 2 months. The man she thought she knew as a quiet mechanic who rarely talked about his military service had actually been a decorated war hero who had continued to serve others throughout his life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Captain Mitchell, Maria said finally, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think I'm making the right choice? Leaving maintenance for flight school? Mitchell considered the question carefully before responding. I think you're making the choice your father would have made in your position. You've proven that you can handle the technical challenges, you've shown courage under pressure, and, most importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of leadership that others will want to follow. But Maria sensed there was more to his answer. But flying is different from maintenance, Mitchell continued. When you're working on an aircraft, you have time to think through problems, to double-check your work, to make sure everything is perfect before you sign off on it. When you're flying, especially in combat, you have to make life or death decisions in seconds, often with incomplete information. Maria nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. How do you learn to handle that kind of pressure? The same way your father learned to handle it, Mitchell replied. Through training, experience, and trusting the people around you. But, most importantly, by remembering that every decision you make affects other people's lives. The sound of helicopters approaching the base interrupted their conversation. Maria looked out her small window and could see two Apaches returning from a mission, their familiar silhouettes sharp against the afternoon sky. Those birds you've been maintaining, Mitchell said, following her gaze. In 6 months, you might be flying aircraft just like them. How does that make you feel? Terrified and excited at the same time, Maria replied honestly. But also ready. For the first time since I enlisted, I feel like I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. Mitchell stood up and extended his hand. Then, I think your father would say you're ready for whatever comes next. Maria shook his hand firmly, then surprised herself by stepping forward and hugging him. Thank you for everything, sir. For the stories, for the letters, for helping me understand who my father really was. Thank you for letting me keep my promise to him, Mitchell replied. Watching you grow into the soldier you've become, it's been like seeing Carlos's legacy continue in the best possible way. As Mitchell prepared to leave, Maria carefully placed her father's silver star and both letters in her personal gear. These items would travel with her to flight school and beyond, reminders of the standards she was expected to uphold and the legacy she was privileged to carry forward. The next 3 days passed quickly, filled with final equipment turn-ins, medical processing, and farewell gatherings with the soldiers who had become like family to her over the past year. Chief Baker presented her with a letter of recommendation that praised her technical skills, leadership potential, and dedication to mission success. Specialist Rodriguez finally worked up the courage to ask for her address so he could write to her during flight school. On her final morning at FOB Viper, Maria walked out to the flight line one last time before her transport departure. The Apache she had worked on most frequently was being prepared for another mission, its weapon systems and engines gleaming under the morning sun. She ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the slight vibrations from the auxiliary power unit and remembering all the hours she had spent ensuring this machine was ready for combat. In a few months, she would be sitting in the cockpit of a similar aircraft, responsible not just for its mechanical operation but for the lives of everyone who depended on its mission success. The patch on her shoulder felt different now, weighted with the knowledge of its true history and the responsibilities it represented. It was no longer just a connection to her father's memory, but a symbol of the standards she was expected to meet and the legacy she was privileged to continue. As her transport aircraft lifted off from FOB Viper, Maria looked down at the base that had been her home for over a year. The maintenance hangars, the flight line, and the living quarters all grew smaller as they gained altitude, but the lesson she had learned there would stay with her for the rest of her life. Flight school would be challenging, and her career as an Army aviator would bring dangers and responsibilities she could barely imagine. But she was no longer the scared girl from El Paso who had enlisted to help her family. She was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, daughter of a war hero, inheritor of a legacy of service and sacrifice, and future pilot of the most advanced attack helicopter in the world. The aircraft carrying her toward her new life climbed higher into the Afghan sky, its destination the United States and the next chapter of a story that had begun in a Vietnamese rice paddy over 40 years earlier. As the landscape below faded into haze and memory, Maria opened her father's first letter one more time and read the words that had become her personal motto: trust your training, trust your instincts, and never forget that the people counting on you deserve your very best. 6 months later, Second Lieutenant Maria Santos would graduate from flight school with honors, earning her wings as an Army aviator and assignment to the same Apache unit where Captain Mitchell served as operations officer. She would go on to fly over 200 combat missions, save dozens of lives, and eventually command her own squadron. But, more importantly, she would carry forward the legacy of courage, dedication, and service that her father had begun in Vietnam and that she had discovered in the shadow of an Apache helicopter on a dusty airfield in Afghanistan. The patch on her shoulder would continue to remind her that some responsibilities transcend individual ambition, and that the greatest honor comes not from personal achievement but from serving something larger than oneself. The girl who had once been only servicing the Apache's gun had become exactly what her father had always known she could be: a leader, a warrior, and a guardian of the values that make service members willing to risk everything for their fellow soldiers and their country. And, in the end, that transformation had begun with a simple moment of recognition between two soldiers who understood that some connections transcend time, distance, and even death itself. A patch, a letter, and a promise kept across 40 years had changed the course of a young woman's life and ensured that a hero's legacy would continue for generations to come.